Today's guest is Lea Bowman. She's a data scientist at Metric 5. And Lea and I met through work she was doing for another organization at my agency at the SEC and just really had a great interaction. And so I was very pleased when she agreed to come on the podcast. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So for those who haven't met you or talked a bit with you, talk about where you're from, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. So I am from Texas. I am a data scientist, like you said, but my work history is across the board, which I know we'll go into. I am interested now really in the ways that we are regulating data science because we're not. And there's a whole lot that isn't actually going particularly well in that sphere. And so like that's I would say that's kind of my sphere of interest, although it doesn't really touch my day-to-day work, but those are the things that I look at when I have free time.
Yeah, so let's roll it back to the time when you were in Austin. And as you're coming out of high school, how did you know what you want to do with your life?
I didn't. Um, when I graduated high school, I thought I was going to be an actress. I started university as a theater major. That time period when people say I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I was 5 years old, that is exactly what I wanted to do when I was 5 years old. And I always planned to be an actress. And then I was studying theater, but I was also taking math classes because I just love math. So I was the theater major taking calculus for fun. And I had been studying French since I was in the ninth grade, and I just loved French. My dad had studied French when he was in university. We used to like practice when I was in high school. We'd be standing at the checkout and he would speak to me in French. Like, I was just in love with French. And I knew I wanted to study abroad. And as a theater major, the opportunities for studying abroad were really limited to very, very expensive affiliate programs in Cannes, and my family doesn't have a lot of money. And so I wanted to travel as like an exchange student, which then you're just paying your university tuition. And so I changed majors from theater to math so I could study math in France. Because I also didn't want to study, and the affiliate programs are often taught in English. And so I didn't want to go to France and like take French history classes, but be studying in English. I wanted to be in classrooms with French people speaking in French, where my only option was to speak French. So that's sort of how I ended up in the major that I was in. So I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And even studying math, I didn't have this was early 2000s, so I didn't have a great direction of this is, I'm going to graduate and this is what I'm going to do with math. It was like, math sounds like fun. Let's do that. And actually, it was really because I didn't know what I wanted. When I graduated, it was hard to find a job because I didn't know what to do with math. And I found, and I don't know if it's as true now, but then a lot of the jobs for math majors required that you go for a master's or a PhD. And so you're like, you've graduated, you think you've accomplished the thing, and then it's like, oh, wait a second, I need to do, more
Mm.
study. So I did apply to PhD programs, and I got into an applied mathematics program at the University of Colorado. And was it Colorado University in Boulder? And but at the same time, I had applied for a visa to be on a working holiday in New Zealand. So it's where you can go, you can do any kind of job as long as it's not permanent. And you have a year from when you get your visa to enter the country, and a year from when you've entered the country to stay and work and travel and do whatever you want. And before I had gotten into my PhD program, gotten my visa for New Zealand. So I had a year, and that year was about to be up. And so I made the decision to go to New Zealand instead of go and do my PhD.
Wow. Now that begs the question then, what interesting job did you do in New Zealand?
So one of the things I did was just clean in backpackers hostels. So it's a really common thing that you do to make your money go further because you don't have to pay for accommodation. And a lot of times if you're there, you stay for 1 to 2 weeks in a hostel, you get to know people, people cook together, and that kind of like also saves money. But what did I do? I worked for Stewart's Coffee Company, and I did their mail out at Christmas, which they thought was going to take 4 days. It took me 2 hours because I did a mail merge in Word, and they didn't know that was possible. Actually what took me the longest was cleaning up the data before doing the mail merge.
Oh,
Um,
wow. That's just shadows of your future.
Exactly, right? And then what else did I managed a backpackers hostel. So I did a lot of cleaning, and then I was working at this hostel, and the woman who was managing was going home for 3 weeks and needed someone to cover. And I had been working there as a cleaner, and she was like, Are you interested in managing?" And I was like, "Sure." And the owner, who was this amazing dude, but very crotchety, actually liked me, so it worked out well. Because if he didn't, you would know. So I ended up staying, and I was almost at the end of my working holiday, and they sponsored me for a work visa, so I stayed for another year.
Oh,
And
wow.
then my parents, my dad has a PhD in mathematics and computer science education, and he found a job at Carnegie Mellon in Qatar, in the Middle East. And I had no idea where it was, when this was 2000, it was 2008. And so I was supposed to be coming back to the States from New Zealand, and my parents moved to Qatar. And so I went to visit them for 3 weeks, and then I spent the summer in Europe, and then decided to go back to Qatar and look for work, which didn't go particularly well. But a little tiny thing, the Doha Tribeca Film Festival was having its first year. And when I was in university, my university job was as a ticket seller for the Frank Erwin Center box office at UT. And they were looking for ticket sellers for the festival. And the guy who was managing the whole box office saw my resume and was like, "Oh my gosh." How are we finding a random person with 7 years of box office experience in Doha, like, who's not part, like, that we didn't ship over to have this experience? And so I worked with them for 3 weeks, and it was great. Oh my gosh, I hardly slept. But it was fantastic. And if you work box office, and especially for events, you end up, like, you learn new ticketing systems because it's going to be different anywhere you are. And then if you're managing, which is, I was like under the manager, but I was helping supervise across the box offices. So you're training people how to use the software you've just learned. And of course, the software is all built on databases. So that was kind of how I started in Qatar, and then I left, and they were having the film festival the next year, and the guy that I worked for brought me back out for the second year. I was supposed to stay for 12 weeks. I ended up staying for 12 years. um, at the end of the festival, so I came as like a box office supervisor, and at the end of the festival, they were going to migrate their festival database application, and they needed someone to do a comparison between, there were a couple of different options. There's not a lot of options, but there are a couple of different applications. I'm sure there's more now. And so I had to do kind of a comparison of the systems. And then they were looking for someone who could just support, who could do training and learn how the system worked and tell people how the system worked. And also, I mean, it's small. So I also was the person, who was working with the developer and helping refine the requirements. So I was kind of acting as a business analyst. I was also sort of acting as the product owner. So someone would come and say, we want this feature, and I would prioritize it with all the other things. So it was all kinds of different things that I didn't even know the names of back then. And then we so the software that we used was a tiny little company with which had one developer who was the company owner and the developer. He had a few people who helped him do support who were kind of experienced people, but he really was the main show. And anytime we wanted to do any kind of reporting, we had to go through him because that required building SQL queries that then, we put into Visual Studio to show people what's going on in the database application. And it was so slow to get him. It's just not priority, right? It's
Right.
reporting. It's not. And so one summer, 2011, a year after I started my job, I took 3 weeks and I taught myself SQL so that I could build the queries that then powered our reports because it was slow otherwise, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing, right? I love hearing things like that where uh out of necessity, because knowledge was needed, roadblocks were in place. Just gonna go figure it out. I'm gonna take a class or two, or buy a book, or all three, all of that, all of the above, and then somehow figure it out. I love it. I love it.
Yep. And for me, it was W3 schools online.
Oh,
I
there you
like
go.
went through
Yeah.
there. They had like free, information on how you could practice your queries, and that's really how I taught myself. Amusingly, I have like 3 boxes of binders of my school university, like all my notes from my classes. And I was flipping through at one point and found SQL code. So I most definitely studied SQL in one of my university classes that I had completely forgotten by that time.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
when we're in the throes of school, right? You're just moving on to the next subject. Just moving on to the next
Yeah.
subject.
Yeah.
Wow. So then, what eventually brought you to be a full-blown data scientist?
So after the Doha Film Institute, so we had in 2014, they did a reduction in workforce, and I was one of the people affected. I found a job at Northwestern University in Qatar. So Northwestern has a building on a campus that houses an American university consortium and called Qatar Foundation. And I started as a business and risk analyst. So I was um, digitizing manual workflows. So where we had someone who took a piece of paper and like walked a student travel application from office to office to get it approved, I built that workflow in SharePoint with Nintex, and then helped create like online forms and processes. And you know how it is. You start with the scope of I'm just going to build this little form and a workflow where people can approve, and then but we also need to track the students and have they done their pre-trip requirements? And so it became this whole thing. And because of that, the IT manager, the director of IT, had spent a lot of time working with me. And so he had an opening. They were starting a new role. Previously, he had managed the user support team and he wanted a little bit more structure in there. So he was adding a manager of user support services. And so I was able to get promoted kind of sideways into the manager of user support services. And because Northwestern is a university, they have incredible benefits. So I was able to do my master's degree, which is in business intelligence and data analytics. But that same program, the year I graduated, was renamed to data science. So I consider it the data science program, but not officially what's on my diploma. But I was able to do that for free
Wow.
through my university. Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
So
I love it when those opportunities happen, right?
I know, and man, every time someone talks to me about, I actually had a former college colleague reach out and say, I'm thinking about doing the data science program, and I know you did it. What are your thoughts? And I'm like, do it. It's free money. Like, do not let go of that free money. It's so worth taking those benefits. And then, even just the people that you meet, the projects, our capstone project, I had never used Python before.
Mm.
And one of my colleagues, there were four of us in the IT team doing our capstone in the same master's program. And so we got to do our capstone project together, and one of the guys was just a Python whiz. And so I learned so much from like the people and from doing that project that I wouldn't have known otherwise.
Wow. Wow. So what brought you back to the United States?
So, my dad was diagnosed with dementia in 2018, and in 2021, so mid-pandemic, I came home for the first time in a year and a half, and he was in terrible shape. And he was living on his own, but he just was not safe to live alone anymore. And so I made the decision to come home so I could take care of him. And coming home, I thought I have all this work experience. It's going to be so easy. I can find a job. There's all these online jobs. And it took me 9 months to find a job. And it's just so hard now. I feel like it's hard to figure out what are real opportunities, but it's also hard to figure out my background's so all over the place that like I can look at product owner roles and I can look at business analyst roles and data scientist roles. And so narrowing that to this is the thing that I'm looking for is really hard. So I had been looking at and kind of going back and forth on there's this, it doesn't exist anymore, but there was a data science fellowship
Mm.
with an organization called the Data Incubator, and it was an 8-week intensive program, and they went through each week was a different topic. So like one week we did SQL, one week we did neural networks, it was all different data science topics. We had to do Python, like what are those called? We had to do a Python problem every morning. There was like an urgent Python problem that we had to solve. And it was great. It was a really neat program. The reason I did it was because they had hiring partners. And I thought, at least if I do this program and they have hiring partners, I can get my resume in front of people and maybe it'll shortlist me. And it worked out in my favor. And one of the hiring partners, I went from over the 9 months, I think I had 2 interviews up to that point. And then with the program, I had 4 interviews in like a 2-week period. And one of the interviews, I was actually interviewing for a different position, but they were talking to me and looking at my background and went, someone just left and you look like you're perfect for that role. So that's how I ended up in a data science role happily. And I had been wanting, like, I knew when I left the university that I wanted to transition to data science. I like doing user support services, but like any service role, it can get tiresome in terms of the way that people interact. And so, I knew that I kind of wanted to move out of that, but I also knew that I wanted to do something more specifically with data. And I missed, when I worked for the Doha Film Institute, I was building reports and I was doing SQL queries. And that's what I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed hearing people say, I'm building this thing in Excel manually to track all of in festival world, like we have all these guests who are coming. I have to track their schedules. I need to know, do we have a flight booked? When is their flight? When are
Hmm.
their events? When are all of these things? And so what I'm doing is I put it all in the database, and then separately, I'm tracking it in an Excel spreadsheet because I need to visualize it in a way that is not available in the application. And so hearing those problems and then being able to work and like figure out my very first pivot table, like doing those things I found just so interesting. That's why I wanted to go into data science, was that the ways that data structures interconnect is just something that my brain loves. And so I wanted to do work that was more in that sphere.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you thrive on solving problems,
Yes, I do like solving problems.
which is a great thing because once you do get the interview and if the people pay attention when they're asking you questions, they begin to understand that about you, you're very valuable because there are lots of problems.
Yeah.
There are lots of problems everywhere. And having somebody who's got, a love and a passion for just figuring those out is an asset, even if it's not in an area that you would have expected them to be in previously. So that I love that. Keep making sure you mention that. Like that, on your resume, chief problem solver should be like the title of what you're looking for.
Yes, I know. I always tell people, if you have something that you've been trying to resolve and you need someone to understand a really complicated problem that kind of doesn't have a really easy to visualize solution, I am your person. I love those kinds of things, where you're looking at a business problem and you really have to understand the business and you need to kind of turn it different ways. That's my favorite. That's my jam.
Yes, awesome. So, Leah, when you look back over this experience you've had, it's been varied and interesting. What's something you would kind of highlight and say, "Man, I wish we didn't do it that way. It's got to be a better way to do that." And I'm going to caveat and make sure we know that we're not trying to say it's wrong. We're not trying to also say we know the right way, but it's something that the right people with the right amount of time and the right focus could make it easier for everybody coming behind us. So, what's something you would highlight?
I think what I would highlight is the thing that I struggled with the most and continue to when I have had to is the whole job search process. And I think specifically in a nascent industry like data science, where you're not going to necessarily find candidates that perfectly have everything that you're looking for. And I as a person trying to be hired struggle to get across the benefits of my experience and how that applies.
Hmm.
And I feel like, a part of me wishes that we would go back to apprenticeships, like that we could, and it was actually something I looked for a lot in that 9 month period where I was like, how am I ever, I'm just never going to find a job. And I had such privilege that I had had a steady job for, the 10 years prior, and I had a really solid backup fund that I ran out of, but only at the very, very end. But, so, I mean, I have a lot of benefits that, I can't imagine. I couldn't be out of work for 9 months now, but that process, I just feel like there's got to be a better way. And especially as we think about, technology, not just data science, but technology more broadly, we have all these new technologies coming in. How do you identify someone who can handle and roll with the punches of the technology that's
Mm.
happening, but doesn't necessarily know it right this very instant? And I feel like we do a decent job of that for fresh grads, right? There's lots of internship opportunities if you can get into them. I I saw a lot of programs for, you've just graduated, you're within 6 months of graduation. IBM has a program. They all have programs because they know you've just graduated and you need this work experience. But you're losing people who have a lot of work experience, who bring a lot to the table, but who aren't a fresh grad
Right.
because there's not that kind of program. There is, I know IBM has one that's for people who've come out of the workforce. So like your mothers who have a computer science degree,
Mm.
had a baby, have been out of the workforce for a few years and they're trying to bring them back in. There actually are some company programs for that. But I just feel like there's got to be a way to get people in and get them trained up because I hear from my brother works for GE, and at the same time as I was sitting there going, I can't get an interview for anything. I can't, I don't know, is it my resume? Is it that these jobs don't exist? I mean, that's one of the big problems on all of these platforms is how fresh or stale are the jobs. But at the same time I'm going, I can't get anything. He's like, we can't get applicants. He had a I think one of his colleagues who had an open position that, they had like two applicants for. And you
Hmm.
just, you look at that and go, I don't,
Yeah.
how do we have this problem on both sides?
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of work to be done in that middle ground of how do you better advertise real opportunities. There are a lot of fake opportunities out there. It's unfortunate. But that are like headhunters that are pretending there's a real job on the other end of that radar
Hmm.
because they're hoping for like some sort of a referral fee or whatever. But real jobs that take into account people as a whole person, and
Yeah.
whole people don't have a linear set of things that they automatically get.
Yeah.
Their career is a winding road with different experiences, and they collect some of those things along the way. But not always. I get frustrated whenever I see, the jobs that say must have, uh, computer science degree and, 12 years of or 15 years of open AI experience. And you're like, the thing
Mhm.
hasn't even existed that
Yeah,
long.
exactly.
What's going
I
on here, right? Or it's like as long as it's been in existence, you have to have experience.
yeah.
And I think it does have a way of devaluing the work that people have accomplished and experienced, and those hiring managers just don't understand what they're losing, really.
Yeah.
I mean, as somebody who works in government, when we're doing contracts, it's the same kind of problem sometimes.
Hmm.
I'm putting out a contract. I'm trying to articulate my requirement to the best of my ability, but I'm also trying not to get 3,000 proposals.
Right.
And so because of that, it gets complicated when you're trying to figure out how do I express what my requirements are? How do I
Yep.
express what certifications I want somebody to have so that, and how do I put this on the street in a way that targets an audience? Anyway, it's the same problem with hiring. I've done a lot of
Yeah.
hiring. I've done a lot of hiring, and you can either have more applicants than you ever knew what to do with, but because many of them are actually not qualified for the job, you got to weed
Hmm.
through them, or like you said, you only get two, and you're like,
Yeah.
ugh, do I have to pick from these two?
Or do I have to go through the whole process of
Yeah,
relist and depending on the bureaucracy of the place, that can be a
yeah,
whole headache in and of itself.
yeah. So I will definitely agree. This is something somebody needs to take a look at and see if they can find a better way. Even all those
Yeah.
companies out there that sell that kind of service, it's still not solved. It's got a long way to
Yeah.
go.
I'm all for I feel like apprenticeships in tech are the way, that like I mean, but you still have the same problem where you might open an application and you have 3,000 applicants and how many of those are qualified? And then, of course, if you're doing apprenticeships, you're trying to upskill people. So
Right.
then it's even harder to validate like I mean, it's a difficult problem.
Yeah, I've never seen a big apprenticeship program for IT other than in the military.
Mm,
Because the military, every job in the military is an apprenticeship track. You always start at the most basic level where they don't let you touch anything. Then they slowly let you touch something more, and you've passed some tests, and so now you've become a journeyman. And then they have an actual, methodology for getting you to become an expert at the job they want you to be an expert at. But once again, that's like early career. That's early, right?
hmm.
Not a lot of people are joining the military. Well, certainly not when they're.
Yeah, not 35 or 40. No,
Right,
and
right. There's
definitely
already
not
limitations
45
on
or
that.
50. Yeah.
There's limitations on that, right? And we are missing out on opportunities, like you're saying, where somebody's gotten a variety of experience or even deep experience in an area and then wants to just leverage that into a sideways career and say, hey, I've learned a ton in here about how to be a great worker and perform and deliver or manage people. And now I want to take a sidestep into a secondary industry or area because I have an interest there.
Mhm.
How in the world do I get in there? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
And especially if you have a technology background, the number of times I've been in an organization and they're like, oh, we're bringing in this new software. Do you have any experience with something like this? And I'm like, yes, I actually, yes, I do, because my background is so varied that
yeah.
there's usually anything you bring in, it's like, oh yeah, I've learned something like that. It won't take me that long to, and I'm very good at learning software
Well, that's the
because
thing.
that's what you have to do.
That's the thing. If you've been around the block, the answer is always yes. Give me the weekend and I will learn
Hmm.
it. Right?
Exactly.
There's it's a little known fact that you don't need to be an expert in certain things. That's
Yeah.
what the internet's for. Uh,
Man, especially program. I mean, you see,
yes.
you need to know, you need to have a brain that works in a specific way to kind of solve the problems,
Yeah.
but how to write it in code, the
You don't need to know that anymore. Yeah.
Stack Overflow, like I ran into this wall. Where do I find, I mean, you have to know the problem yourself. That's actually the harder part is we have a business problem. We need a solution, doing all of the work that takes you to, okay, now I just write the code,
Well, I
the
think
three lines of code.
the most fulfilling experience you will ever have in your career is when you're searching something like Stack Overflow for an answer to your problem, and the answer was one you wrote.
Yes,
And you had just forgot because you moved on to a different project and a different problem.
absolutely.
Oh gosh. So Leah, what's coming up for you here in the near future?
So for me, the thing that I'm most interested in, so I went into data science and I realized that actually, and I think part of it's that we're refining all the terms around data science, right? So it's, now it's not just data scientist, you have data engineer and you have analytics engineer. And I think, in my next career move, which will probably be a little while because I just started on a new contract. But the thing that I'm most interested in is actually data engineering. So, where data science is handling um, I feel like the output of the data. So how do you take that data and do things? Data engineering handles the logistics of how do you get that data to the person who needs to use it. And that's actually the place that I find the most interesting is the ways that we house the data, the ways that we organize the data, and especially as we have these data lakes and data warehouses, or even old technology now, but as we're expanding our concepts and as our data is expanding, how do we manage that in an interesting way? So I feel like that's something that I am looking forward to in the future.
Well, yeah, this has been a great conversation. I've had a joy getting to know you better and hearing your history. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.